Hi, it's Richard here from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting with another in our irregular series about JavaScript extensions in Oracle Policy Modeling. This time out, we're going to be looking at a container control. Now, it's important to recognize that there are two controls that have similar names. There's an entity container, which is designed, as its name suggests, to focus on the instances in an entity. And then there's the container control, which is the subject of this presentation. We'll be looking at entity containers and other kinds of entity-based controls in later episodes in this series. Before we get started, what is a JavaScript control extension? If you're coming to this fresh, you've been given the job of creating a control extension for Oracle Policy Modeling. What the heck is it? It's a JavaScript file that you add to your Intelligent Advisor project. And within that JavaScript file, within the constraints laid down by Oracle, you can write JavaScript code and leverage various objects and methods and functions provided by the JavaScript extension API. For example, if you're building a container extension, you'll be able to access the interview as an object and be able to call methods that belong to the interview to obtain information about it. And you'll also be able to use typical JavaScript to construct HTML, for example, with jQuery. Every extension has a specific type. So if you talk about a custom label or a custom container or a custom input, you're uniquely identifying the kind of control it is. Obviously, for example, a custom input is going to be an input control. A custom label will be something static or at least something non-input based. And a custom container is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to be a customized version of the standard control provided by Oracle Policy Modeling. And that's something we'll see in the demonstration is all these control extensions are extensions of what exists. So a control extension for a container basically lets you override or extend in some way the behavior of a standard container. Similarly, for a custom input, you're going to be providing over and above or in some way different to the standard Oracle policy or Oracle policy modeling input control. Each control extension, so custom control or custom input, is subject to various constraints in terms of you'll be given a template from which to work with. A good example would be that an input control, a custom input, will require you to both design the user interface, but also handle things like validation and also things like when the control needs to be updated. Obviously, if you're working with a different kind of control, for example, a label, which is generally static text, then there are fewer things to have to worry about. You don't have to validate data entry in a label because there is no data entry. So there's kind of like a template for each of them. And we'll talk about how you can get those templates and how you can generate them or how you can write them yourself in just a little while. In all of those cases, you are able to, within the constraints of the template, write JavaScript code. Naturally enough, there are strict rules for what you should and shouldn't do in these extensions. These are user experience or user interface extensions. They therefore are useful for giving your users something more attractive, more appropriate, or more interactive. But they are not to be used, for example, to change the outcome of an interview. We're not messing with the determinations engine. We're messing with how the HTML is rendered at the end result of the interview. How do you get started then? How do you get hold of these templates? Well, as you'll see in the demo, you can either write your own, or you can use something like the Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting's code generator, which is a Oracle Intelligent Advisor project, which you can see in the screenshot here, which will ask you some questions and then will generate a template for you. It's a great way of creating boilerplate code that you can then test and add to, and we'll look at that in the demo. So a custom container. This is the subject of our chapter today. So on the screenshot on the right, you can see that there are several different containers. There's one in the Choose Your Journey page. There's one in the Your Journey Details page. And in fact, if you look at the Your Journey Details page, you'll see there are several of them. It's good to realize that a container, when you're in Oracle Policy Modeling, its default name, as you can see, is container, but you'll also see there in Your Journey Details, there's one called Results. You can click on the container and give it a name. Now, this name is just for you, the developer of the interview, and is not really relevant to when you're working with a custom container. But when you're looking through somebody else's project, look out for that square icon with the grid inside it, because that's a container. A container contains things. I know that sounds really obvious, but that's basically what it's for. A container can contain labels, as you can see in Your Journey Details. A container can contain attributes, as you can see in the Choose Your Journey one on the right. And a container can contain other containers. As you can see, the results container contains 2 child containers. And you can carry on nesting. And that's how a lot of standard interviews get some cool kind of side-by-side or column-based layouts. They're very popular for doing column-based layouts because they allow you to choose whether you want to have things horizontally or vertically spaced. And with nesting, you can do some pretty sophisticated stuff. But at a basic level, a container is just a box, and it translates roughly to an HTML div, and as standard we'll have a class in CSS that looks like something like OPA-container-vertical or a variation thereof. So what can we do in JavaScript with a container? We spoke a moment ago about how every piece of JavaScript extension code has to handle significant events in the life cycle of that object. And we talked about how in an input you would have to generate the HTML, you would have to validate the data entry, and so forth. A container has essentially 3 basic object keys. The mount key, which is essentially initialization. You would, for example, in the mount, write code to draw the box, or whatever it is that you're planning to render as HTML. In the update key, if your box or whatever's in it needs to be updated because something else has happened, then you would need to write code in here to handle the update. And to be good citizens, you should also write code in unmount, which is essentially the end of life. Let's say that the user is leaving your page and has clicked the next button. Is there anything you need to do to tidy up? Do you need to null any variables? Do you need to disconnect from something? Or do you need to just make your code, make your graphical object disappear? That's your unmount. So now we know that a container is basically a blank space. A div, what can we use it for? Well, the smart answer would be for anything at all because it's a container. But let's think about what I think is the primary reason. The primary reason of writing a piece of JavaScript to look at or handle a container is because you want access to something inside the container. The documentation online specifies that a container extension is used to render both the container and any controls contained within the container. So it doesn't really provide any functionality, but it gives you access to things inside it. So a simple example, which we'll come up against in a minute, is that if you have a container in your interview that contains 5 attributes, and you wanted to draw a picture based on those 5 attributes, I don't know, you wanted to draw a graph based on those 5 attributes, then the container extension would give you an easy way of accessing those 5 attributes and their values, after which you could choose to do whatever the heck you want in HTML. So it's very commonly used for aggregations, charting, or manipulations of that kind. So it all starts with a div. You could do anything really. That's the silly answer is you can do anything with it. You could stick an image in it. You could collate information in a pleasing way. You could, well, there's a good example in the standard project, the example called the loan advisor. And going back to what we just said, the key thing is to realize that when you're working with a container, you get to access the get controls method. So get controls will give you a list of the top level controls inside the container. So control 0.getValue gets the value of the first control inside the container. Bear in mind that it only gives you the first level. So if you have a container in a container in a container, you might find yourself having to navigate up and down a hierarchy. But basically, get controls gives you an array of controls which are what are inside the container. So let's take a look at a nice example. This is an example project called Healthy Eating. So if you've ever used the example projects, and if you have never done so, I don't know why. The Healthy Eating project has been slightly tweaked in this example to take one set of information and produce a live chart. So the chart is a container, and the container contains the attribute that is needed for this particular exercise. But you could do it in many other ways. On the left-hand side, you can see that there's actually a jQuery dialog, and in that jQuery dialog, you can see a PDF file. So the container in this case is rendering a PDF file, probably using an object tag or an embed tag. On the right-hand side, you also have an embedded HTML page. So that's another container. Just a word of advice, if you're going to use embedding iframes or object tags as part of your container extension, bear in mind that there may be some content security restrictions, and often websites will prohibit you from doing that. With basically, they will deny you the ability to put them in an embed or an object or an iframe. For example, if you're using B2B Service Cloud from Oracle, you need to change the parameters, the configuration of the B2B Service Cloud site to be able to get this to work. So in those two examples, we were presenting external content. You could say in a way that, well, isn't that the same as the stuff you showed us a few weeks ago in the custom input extensions video? Is that not the same as just saying, yeah, I'm going to display a map in a label? Or, well, bear in mind that the choice of control or control extension depends what you want to do with it. If you wanted to let someone select a location on a map, and you wanted to validate that location in some way, or you wanted to update, clearly it's an input control, whereas a container could show a map. If you wanted to interact with the map in any way, you would have to get down to building your own events, handling the click, the drag of the flag, and you'd have to do a lot of work. Whereas if you were using an input control, you would at least have mount, validate, update, and unmount that were pre-wired for you, if you like, in your input control. So with extensions, it often comes down to, what is it I'm trying to do? Am I trying to display stuff? Am I trying to input stuff? And the choice will then be driven by what your answer is to that question. So in this video, we're going to look at a couple of things. We're going to look at implementing a dynamic chart, and we'll see a couple of interesting things along the way. And we will highlight also the example chart and give you a few more ideas about how to generate template code. So in our little demo for this video about custom container extensions, we're going to start by addressing the question of templates. Whenever you build an extension, you're building it according to a framework defined by Oracle. And therefore, to a certain extent, the structure of your code is predefined by whatever the label is assigned to the control, so custom container or custom input or custom label, but also to the object keys that are available. And as such, this means that you could end up building yourself a big library of examples or boilerplate code, or you could use something like the template code creator, which you'll find on our online store. The template code creator, which I'm just going to demonstrate from the debugger here, is a way to quickly obtain working examples of pretty much all of the JavaScript extensions. It comes with a drop-down list where you can select the thing that you're trying to create. So I'm going to try and create a container. and you accept the usage. And then according to the kind of control you've selected, it's going to ask you some basic questions. Do you want to have some console output that'll help you debug? If you're going to use this as a custom container control, you're probably going to want to have a custom property assigned to the control, so you can add a custom property here. And if you're using a custom container, then you'll need to give, where necessary, an entity name, an HTML element name, and so forth. So in this case, I'm going to use an entity called entity, and we'll call this entity. And what's the entity, so this is the natural language. So you basically go through the list of attributes and entities that you're going to work with, and click Next. And after a brief delay, you'll find yourself looking at a working piece of code. So you can then take that code and copy and paste it into your JavaScript file and see how it works. You could also, of course, go back to the beginning and choose a different kind of object. So this time we'll do a custom input and basically answer a few more questions. And the questions, of course, will be different depending on the control type. Do you want some demonstration code? Yes, I do. And there's your working code for a custom input this time. As well as generating the code, you get a explanatory PDF file, which is very useful if you've never done any of these before, because it'll let you download the PDF file, and from the PDF file, you'll be able to understand more about the example that we're trying to give you. In fact, a lot of people will actually generate this file to begin with, and you'll go and take a look at whatever it is you're interested in. So I'm interested in custom container. It requires a bit more explanation, and it walks you through what to expect and what you need to do to get the example working. And it also, where appropriate, if we look at the beginning, gives you some very useful basic concepts about how the JavaScript extensions work, how the keys work, what other keys you can expect to see, where they're used, and so forth, and obviously how to use the code generator. You don't have to do that, of course. You can write the code yourself and keep it in a notepad file, but this is one way of speeding things up, certainly. And now we're going to look at one of the example projects. The example project we're going to look at is called Loan Advisor. So if you haven't already opened the Loan Advisor, go ahead and open that example project. Why? Because it has actually got a good example of a custom container within it. If we take a look at the loan, you'll see it's not a particularly complicated project. But you'll notice down the bottom here in this little container, it says loan amount for custom graph, total interest for custom graph. So it has two attributes inside this container. So if we go and click, there you go. So this particular container is going to give us access to these attributes. That's what we meant in the presentation by saying that a container would give you access to the elements within it. It also has custom properties, which get to the right place. It also has custom properties, which you can see are picked up in the JavaScript, so we know which when to execute our JavaScript code or not. The example code is very full and does exactly what you'd expect it to do. It has the disadvantage of essentially being a built from scratch chart. So it can feel a little bit complicated to understand how it works, especially because it's using SVG vectors to create the pie chart. Great idea, but perhaps overkill for us for the demonstration that I'm about to do. What does matter is that at the top you can see, if we scroll down to where the actual container, the actual extension starts, is custom container. So custom container is the marker that says this is a custom container. And you will see that we have the mount key for the setup and initialization, the update key if anything needs to be updated, and in this case they haven't put an unmount, but they could have done. So it's well worthwhile your time going into that and just executing it from the debugger, entering some money, and observing the chart, and seeing that the chart has been built using the two attributes that you saw a moment ago in the screen in Oracle Policy Modeling, and that's what it looks like. So this is a great example of aggregating, charting information that was sitting in the control. The actual detailed example we're going to look at is kind of based on that concept, but taking a little step further. Again, it is going to use an example project. I'm a great fan of the example projects, as you should be too. This started out as the healthy eating example project. If you want to get hold of the full code of this example and the details of how it works, then you'll find that in the Consultant's Guide to JavaScript Extensions on Amazon. If we take a brief look, we'll see here that we have food consumed. And we have just above our chart control here, just above there, we have an entity collect where we collect children and we collect the data regarding their food. And our particular container, in this case, has nothing in it. So we're actually going to go and grab the data about the child entity just to demonstrate that you don't always have to have everything inside the chart because, of course, the JavaScript API lets us access other information in the interview. Again, I have a custom property so that I can pick it up in the JavaScript. And this is what the code looks like. Before going any further, I want you to notice that the code uses D3. So it uses data-driven charting. So it's going to use the standard D3 library. It's also going to use standard jQuery library. And the actual chart looks like this. So once again, it's a custom container. And we check our custom property that we saw in the control on the screen. And we have a mount, an update, and an unmount. That's essentially the management of our container. We have a couple of other functions here. You'll see we have a select color, which I'm sure you don't need any explanation, is going to choose different colors depending on the value. So the more meat or the more sweets you eat, then the colors are going to change. That's nothing great, nothing revolutionary there. And then we have a function called draw chart. Draw chart is going to use D3 standard techniques to draw the chart. So this isn't even necessary for me to say how it works. You just have to go and read the D3 documentation online. What is key to this is that we're going to use some data, and the HTML element that represents our container is going to be the place where we will position our chart. The data is going to be designed by us in our mount or our updates. So we're going to build the chart at the beginning when we initialize it, and then we'll update the chart accordingly when you start entering data into your entity collect. So the mount basically uses something called the server state. So you probably knew this, that when you're looking at an interview in Oracle Intelligent Advisor and you are creating new entity instances, if you were to say, create a child in this interview and enter the number 2 in the number of sweets that they eat, before you click next, if you then in JavaScript interrogate the value of the sweets for that child, you'll get the answer of null, unknown. There will be none. The actual value is not passed to the engine until you click the next button. So when we mount, we're going to see if there are any existing values already saved. For example, if we're in the debugger or if data has been loaded in. And then we're going to iterate through the records belonging to the child entity. And in our case, we're just going to go and grab the servings of sweets. Now, these are all the the attribute names of the attributes in the original project, so child serving sweets. And we're going to build ourselves a JavaScript object composed of all of the existing children and the value of the number of sweets that they've eaten. So that list of records is going to be our input data, which will then be passed to D3 to create the chart. So server state will give you the state of the entity, if you like, when you arrive on the page. Most of the time, the answer will be there'll be nothing in it, but if data has been loaded into it before you get to it, well, then you'd see it. The trick is in the update that we're going to use instead the client state. So if you've just entered a new number in the suites and you haven't clicked next yet, server state would return the old value. client state will return the new value. So it gives you the ability to detect and modify your chart based on the values entered by the user before they click the next button. Other than that, it's pretty much the same routine. It creates the list of objects and then deletes and redraws the chart. Unmount is nice and clean, just removes the chart before we leave. So it looks a little bit like this. I'll reinitialize the debugger and make it full screen. So here's the name, and just go through this part. And we come to entering children's names. You'll see that there's a blank chart underneath because currently there is absolutely no data, whether it be child state or client state or server state, there's nothing in it. So I'm going to type in Richard, 1 vegetable, 2 grains, 3 fruit, 1 dairy, 3 protein, and 4 sweets. So the client state, the update key, has detected that sweets has changed. So there we go with a number 4. If I change it to 3, you'll notice that the color has changed again. If I go to 2 or 1, that's getting a bit better. So yeah, let's leave it at 4. If I now add a second child, who's much better at this sort of thing than I am, lots of fruit, no dairy, lots of protein, and only 1 sweet, we'll notice now that the second child has been added. So, and of course, if we change this, we'll see it live changing. So the chart is only charting the sweets, but it's charting it based on the current client state. If I now move forward to the next page and continue my work, if I come back, the initial load has loaded the server state, the state that is currently in here. So now if I change these, of course I've changed the sweets, then the client state is winning again. So it's using client state and server state to provide a dynamic chart. That just about wraps up our little demo. Let's consider another one. Here's another example of a custom container. This time from based on another example project called Copyright Permissions. And on the final page, you'll notice that there's a container that occupies the most part of this page, and it has a single attribute inside it, but the control itself, in this case, is going to be once again a custom container, but is actually going to embed a website in the container based on an object tag. And of course, you could use this to create a dynamic embed so that depending on the purpose, you could maybe make a search in the target website, or you could pull up different pages. That's quite a common one. And at the end of that, what happens is you run it. So let's run this in the full-scale browser because, well, quite often with this sort of thing, the embeds don't work properly in the embedded debugger. So I'll enter my name, fill in the basic information, answer a few questions. We have an embedded website show up and a search has been made according to our requirements. So these are hopefully pertinent results that we can then access. That just about wraps it up for our double demo. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video soon. Don't forget to like the video, and if you feel you enjoyed these videos about Intelligent Advisor, subscribe to our channel. See ya. So that just about wraps it up for our tour of container extensions. So they can display just about anything. They do have a weak point, but that's by design. They are not designed for data input, really. They're designed for aggregations, charts, displays. They're not supposed to be an input control. If you need an input control, go look at custom input or full custom input or something like that, or entity collect. They're all designed to help you enter data. You can interact with a container to some degree, but it'll be outside the framework of Oracle Intelligent Advisor. You could interact with the chart, you could build interaction with the chart, but that would be down to whatever library you built the chart with. Anyway, consider the container for aggregations, charts, and external views. Use the entity container if you're going to display entity instance data. It's much easier. And if you're going to do input, use an entity collect if it's entity-based, or just use a custom input or full custom input. And we've covered all those we've covered inputs in previous videos, and we'll be talking about entity containers and entity collects in later videos. That's it for now. See you next time.